Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Ahmed Moor, a fellow at the Foundation. Today is March 14th, 2025, and I'm excited to moderate a conversation about the role of Israel's genocide in Gaza and the US's facilitation of it, and the impact on the 2024 elections. Here with me are political strategist and former FMEP Fellow Rania Batrice, Maya Berry of the Arab American Institute, and Margaret Zaknoen DeReus, Executive Director of the IMEU Policy Project, which is affiliated with the IMEU, the Institute of Middle East Understanding. For more on the work of all three of my guests, see the show notes, where you will also find each of their bios, which in the interest of time, we're not going to get into in depth. But I will ask you all to provide just a brief overview to start of your work. Before I get there, though, I want to state clearly that FMEP is a 501c3 foundation that does not engage in any lobbying. Today's podcast is intended solely for educational purposes, which is to explore really the public debate and share information and analysis. And again, we're going to link to all of your work when we post the podcast. But to start, Maya, will you just provide a brief overview of your work, and then we'll go around the table. Maya, I think you may be muted.
Of course I am, because how would we possibly start with at least one person doing that? Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you, FMEP, for hosting these incredibly important conversations. I listen all the time, and I'm delighted to be here with both Rania and Margaret, two colleagues whose work I admire greatly. The Arab American Institute was established back in 1985 at a time when our co-founders deemed a very specific problem of civic engagement for Arab Americans. They called it the politics of exclusion, which is that Arab Americans were not allowed to basically engage at the civic engagement table because of their advocacy on the issue of Palestinian human rights. This is our 40th year. We continue to do exactly that and work to empower Arab Americans as a civil rights advocacy organization in every aspect on these issues. So we work on issues related to democracy. We work on issues protecting civil rights and civil liberties. And we work on issues related to human rights.
Thank you, Maya. Next, we'll go to Rania.
Yes, so happy to be here too, and just echo Maya's adoration for both Maya and Margaret, and I've had the pleasure of working alongside both the Arab American Institute and IMEU's Policy Project and IMEU as well. And I am the short answer is I'm a consultant, but I like to say that I'm one of the good ones because I feel like consultant is a four-letter word these days. Everybody's favorite party trick is that I was Bernie Sanders' deputy campaign manager in 2016, but this month actually marks 25 years that I've worked in this really awful, terrible, horrible industry of politics, but I also work in advocacy and coalition building, and I'm a first-generation Palestinian American, and I often say that, I wake up every day Palestinian. All of my work over all of those years has really come back to the idea of collective liberation, including for my own people, but for the broader communities that we've seen come fight alongside us for many, many years, frankly, but also for the last 18 months as well. So yes, that's me in a very quick nutshell.
Thank you, Rania. And that is a good party trick. Margaret?
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you, FMEP. I'm really pleased to be a part of this important conversation and thrilled to be with my partners in this, Rania and Maya as well. I serve as the executive director of both the IMEU, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, and the IMEU Policy Project, which is our affiliated C4 organization. IMEU was formed 20 years ago now to bring Palestinian voices and perspectives and those of allies in the struggle for Palestinian freedom into mainstream US media, because we believe that better policy comes with more informed voters and citizens. And for far too long, Palestinians were spoken about a lot in US media, but had limited opportunity to sort of represent ourselves and speak directly to American news consumers. And so IMEU was created to change that. We launched our affiliated C4 just last year. And through the IMEU Policy Project, we work to educate elected officials, candidates, and voters, and advance policies that are supportive of Palestinian rights and freedom.
Thanks, Margaret. I guess the first question really is for Margaret. Are we underrepresented now that Chuck Schumer is a Palestinian? Bad joke. Okay. More seriously, you lead an organization, the IMEU Policy Project, that engages with public debate around Palestine and the elections. And you just completed this big survey highlighting the role of the genocide on voter behavior. Can you explain both how the poll was conducted? Because I think there was a lot of rigor around the poll itself, and then what your conclusions are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just start, Ahmed, by saying that even before we conducted the poll, which we ran in December and January, the signs that Biden's support for Israel's genocide in Gaza would hurt Democrats were clear months before the election. We saw that in the nearly 1 million people who cast their ballot for uncommitted in the Democratic primary, and the hundreds of thousands of people, especially young people, who were out in the streets, and in numerous pre-election polls, including actually one that IMEU Policy Project conducted last August with YouGov, that found that Democrats and independents in the key swing states of Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia would have been more likely to vote for Vice President Harris if she had pledged to withhold weapons to Israel. We provided that data to the Harris campaign, and of course, the people who power the Democratic Party pleaded with the Biden administration throughout to change course. But what we heard repeatedly from Harris on the campaign trail was that there would be no change in weapons policy if she were president. So after her loss, we really wanted to understand what role that played for voters. So we ran another poll, again with YouGov, that we released in January. This was an online survey of 1,078 registered voters. More than half were voters who had voted for Joe Biden in 2020, but did not vote for Kamala Harris in 2024. And the rest were voters in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, who both voted for Biden in 2020 and did vote for Harris last year. And of course, the sample was weighted according to gender, age, race, and ethnicity, education, and U.S. Census region.
Sorry, to be clear, is that Democrats and independents or Democrats only in the sample?
It was Democrats and independents.
Please
And
continue.
we found in the poll that the top concern for Biden 2020 voters who cast a ballot for someone besides Harris in 2024 was ending Israel's violence in Gaza. So 29% of these voters cited it not as an issue that impacted their choice, but as the number one issue affecting their vote choice, ahead of the economy, which came in at 24%. So that included 38% of voters in Arizona, 32% in Michigan, 32% in Wisconsin, and 36% of voters under 45. By a nearly 4-to-1 margin, Biden 2020 voters who cast a ballot for someone besides Harris, including non-voters, said that they would have been more likely at 36% to vote for her if she had pledged to withhold weapons to Israel, rather than less likely at 10%. And by a 7-to-1 margin, Biden 2020 voters who did vote for Harris in swing states said that they would have been more enthusiastic in their support of her at 35% if she had pledged to withhold weapons to Israel, rather than less enthusiastic at 5%. So they may have voted for her, but they may have door knocked or phone banked or donated. And I'll share just a couple more findings. 56% of these voters say that they would prefer to support a candidate who voted to withhold weapons to Israel, while just 16% said the opposite. And a majority of both groups, both those who voted for Biden in 2020, but not Harris in 2024, and those who voted for Harris in swing states, say that they believe Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. And despite this, we're still not seeing Democratic leaders in Washington listen to their voter base. So in less than 2 months in office, President Trump has approved over $11 billion in weapons to Israel, but only a tiny sliver, less than 10% of Democratic members of Congress, have signed on to resolutions to block those weapons.
Thank you. I mean, comprehensive and important, and unearthing something that there was a lot of talk about, but there wasn't a lot of meaningful data around. But if somebody, so I fully agree with the poll, and just to be clear, I didn't vote for Harris. I voted third party for that reason. But if somebody was listening to this and said, thinking, well, you all are partisans, you're somehow, Palestinian or associated with Palestinian rights movements. How much credibility do you have? How do you respond to that as a pollster?
Yeah.
Or rather, somebody who's conducted a poll.
Yeah, and I would say that, we at IMEU Policy Project are not pollsters, but we worked on both of our polls, pre-election and post-election, with YouGov, which is a widely used, reputable polling firm. We also made the entire poll available on our website. So if anyone wants to look at exactly how we asked the questions, what the methodology was, that's all publicly available. And I guess I would say that we took care in drafting these questions to really be sure that we were learning what we wanted to learn. So for example, when we drafted the question about what was the top issue that affected your vote choice, we very intentionally phrased it as ending Israel's violence in Gaza, right? Because we understand that for some people, if we had merely identified it as the fighting between Israel and Hamas or the situation in Gaza, we might be hearing from people that felt differently, right? Like we didn't want to accidentally count people who made that choice, but were coming from the opposite perspective. So with YouGov's guidance and advice, we were rigorous and careful in how we drafted questions. And again, it's all publicly available on our website.
Thank you. Rania, I'd like to ask you a question. So for many years, you've been a key player in progressive organizing and political campaigns. And so will you talk to us about the Harris campaign and Democratic Party, how they navigated the genocide? And from my own perspective, I for a long time believed that public opinion would be upstream of policy, and people would change their minds and consequently would see things happen from a policy point of view. And the genocide has put the lie to all of that. You see that over 70% of Democrats opposed the genocide, and yet Biden we kind of dug in a little bit, it seemed like. So how do you explain all of that? Can you just kind of reflect on those dynamics?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is not new, to just put it mildly. There has been, even among progressives, there's even a term for it, PEPs, progressive except for Palestine. And that there is a term for it because it's not new. I do always feel the need, even for just my own mental well-being, to say out loud that we've made a ton of progress and educated, and frankly, in large part because of the work of organizations like the Arab American Institute and like IMEU, in just educating people about the realities, the history, what's going on. Because for so many people in this country, they first became aware of what the plight of the Palestinian people has been for 76 years, or almost 77. Yeah, almost 77 years in October of 2023. So for us, we live this and breathe it, and we, have, some of us have family there and all of those kinds of things. But for the American population, a lot of the American population, this has been new information. But for the powers that be, and some of the folks that Margaret was even talking about, it's not necessarily new information, but there has been an active, decades-long, very intentional, I'm just going to say it, propaganda machine at work in order to keep people in line, to keep politicians in line. We'll just talk about that. I could talk about all kinds of other people who are being kept in line as well. But in order to ensure that funding continues, in order to make sure that people don't speak out, even folks who know better, even people who know the truth, who will behind closed doors say things like, listen, I'm with you and I know what's going on and this is atrocious and terrible, but like, if I say anything, if I put my neck out there, if I say anything publicly, they're going to primary me, or they're going to dump a bunch of money for, into my opponent's campaign. All of those things, which we of course saw play out very publicly, even this past cycle, in the last primaries, none of that is new. None of that is new. And this is a point. Also, apologize. I feel like I'm a little bit all over the place. It's also an important point that I will put out there, that those entities that spend all those millions and millions and millions of dollars against our allies in Congress who dare to speak out and dare speak the truth about the history and what has been going on and what continues to be going on, are never in their paid media. That's their funding. That's where they put most of their funding, in paid media. That's paid media is television advertising, mail, direct mail. Everybody who's listening who just may not know these terms, when you get all of those really annoying pieces of mail from politicians, that's called direct mail. That's paid from campaigns or independent expenditures, third parties, or the ads you see during a campaign. If you notice, the vast majority of the dollars that are being spent on that messaging do not mention Israel or Palestine in them. And that is very intentional, because the reality is what we saw play out over all these months, and what Margaret was mentioning, we had all this data about where the American population was as far as their feelings on how our tax dollars were being spent. The genocide, even when if people don't even want to call it genocide in Gaza, but the atrocities being carried out in Gaza, and now of course in the West Bank, the American population, public opinion was, whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, or nothing, none of the identified of none of those, was very much against it. And so it's such an intentional play that these entities that are majority funded by evangelical Christians, I will also point that out, dumping a lot of information on folks, I apologize. They don't mention these things because it's not popular in this country. And we saw it play out over and over and over. And I mentioned at the top that I am a consultant, I'm a strategist. I am one of those people. I think polling is a really important tool. I think in politics, people use polling a little too much as sort of like the end all be all. Like this is the message and we have to stick to it. I believe a little bit more in some common sense and getting into the community and what's actually going on. But when you have 6, 12, 16, 18 months of data showing you a consecutive up, the line continuously goes up and people are continuously saying, we are not on board with this, I think that's a pretty good indicator of where the American population is. And Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris and the folks around them said, we don't care. And unfortunately, they were operating from an old playbook, an old political playbook. That was the play. You can say anything you want about anything you want, except for when it comes to Israel. You better stay in line. You better stick to the talking points, or we're going to come after you. We're going to pull money. All the threats are constant. And I will I just want to say this real quick, and then I promise I'll shut up. But because I do think it's important, I will say that there were some people around Vice President Harris who, I've said this publicly, I've also said it privately, who were fighting like hell alongside us to push her and were ignored. I think that's really, really important, because I don't want to act as though every single person in her orbit was on that same page. There were legitimately people on her team who were trying to push for a number of different reasons. One, for humanitarian reasons, but two, for very strategic reasons, because they saw the same things that we were seeing. So anyway, right. I'll stop now.
No, but okay, so I was one of the people who, I think like lots of people, called my representatives, Dwight Evans here in my district, John Fetterman, who turned out to be something I think nobody imagined he would be. And it was all for nothing. you would get a staffer on the phone and issue your kind of 2 minutes of feedback, and that was it. So is the feedback process fundamentally broken? Does it matter?
I will say, generally speaking, yes. When we're talking about legislation, in almost any other respect, on healthcare, on any number of other types of funding, I know for certain that the vast majority of offices are actually registering how many calls they're getting, how many emails they're getting, the number of communications they're getting on each side of an issue. And I'm not saying that that doesn't happen on our issues. It does. But the reality is, oftentimes it just gets ignored. Sometimes it doesn't. Listen, there are members that we have pushed, and we have pushed onto our side, and when I say pushed, I mean we've educated. I think it's important that we say it that way. And then there's some that, Fetterman's a perfect example. He is going to do and say whatever he's going to do and say, and he's got the backing of AIPAC and DMFI, and he's their newest darling, and we could flood his phone lines, and I'm not saying we shouldn't continue to do that, and their inboxes and things like that, and he's going to continue to do and say the things he's going to do and say. So I mean, there's a lot of problems with our system, but I just want to be very, very, very clear that those calls and those emails and that outreach from constituents to their House members and to their senators is incredibly important.
Thank you. And so now, thanks, Rania. I want to transition to Maya. Maya, you've been working in politics for more than 2 decades, including in your current role as the head of the Arab American Institute, a national civil rights advocacy organization, as you discussed earlier. So based on your years of experience, will you talk to us about your interpretation of the 2024 election, the national election, especially in the Arab American community in Michigan? Are people disempowered? Are they disengaged? I've changed my voter registration. I don't know if I should be saying that on this call, but I have. So how's the community reacting? Are people reeling? Are they cynics, or have they engaged with more energy?
Look, I think the way I can start to answer that question is to say there was nothing normal about the 2024 presidential election. People were making determinations on their vote based on what they generally make their decision on. And I'm speaking about this particular point on behalf of Arab American voters who, to be clear, the Arab American Institute has been polling since the mid-1990s. We do Arab American polling. We also do American attitudes about issues of concern. And when we've done that polling, while the issues related to, say, Palestine or Lebanon or Iraq or Yemen, whatever that immediate, regrettably, crisis from the Arab world as it plays out, are always high on folks' list, it's never the top, because in our scientific polling, as Margaret pointed out, you don't do push polling, you don't do leading questions, you're gauging voter opinions on these matters. So Yellow Vote's first poll was in 1998. So Yellow Vote tracking polls have existed for us at this point for decades. And the top issues regularly, and folks may not be surprised about this, are education, healthcare, gun violence. When there's a surge in attacks on local schools, you'll see gun violence come up more. So your average Arab American voter is doing what every voter in this country is trying to do, which is to provide a better life for their kids and their family and their colleagues. And then you have what happened post-October, which was that Arab Americans are not naive about where American policymakers are on the issue of Palestine. They understand it deeply. They are keenly aware of how it's impacted them, including, as I opened up with, our civic engagement and political empowerment. But what happened post-October 7th was that you saw, under a Democratic administration, a policy of full-on enabling genocide And the second part of it that I think is critical and required a bit of cognitive dissonance to be able to say, how is this possible, is some of the data that Margaret shared in the beginning. And I would offer a data from a poll that we did in September of American, this is not Arab American voters, these are American voters. So we put this out September 5th, over 2,000 American voters. And when we asked them to rank their top issues, their top 11 issues, Gaza only had about 7%. But think about this for a moment, right? American voters, not Arab Americans, 7% of them said Gaza. And then when you ask the question, how important is Gaza in determining your vote? I'm going to read it to get it exactly right. 15% said very important, and 33% said somewhat important. So American voters generally, not any of the four of us, not anyone connected, but simply because of the unprecedented nature of what was happening and how they were seeing it, how it was being digested for the first time by your average American. From that, we ended up with 48% saying that it was either very important or somewhat important to how they intended to vote in November. That's a September poll, just a month out from the November. So it's extraordinary to suggest that if the issue broke through, and God bless our young people on these college campuses who helped lead that, if the issue broke through to your average American voter, then of course, it's going to impact the way Arab Americans vote. So the nearly 4 million Arab Americans in this country spread out throughout the country. And I would love to spend a little bit of time on this point because you're asking me about Michigan for good reason. And I want to be clear on this. I'm a Dearborn kid. I'm from Dearborn, Michigan. So anyone comes for Dearborn, they're coming for me and I'm ready to fight. But to be clear, Dearborn is not representative of the entire Arab American community nationally. So while the press that wanted to blame Arab Americans for the outcome of the election and say, look, you elected Trump, we are still, I want to point this out, before the election, the hate mail we got was what you would expect, the kind of, you're anti-Semites, you're terrorists, you're this. After the election, and that's from the right, after the election, we're getting it from the left. We deserve to be nuked because we elected this guy. And the point I want to make clear is if every Arab American in this country voted for Kamala Harris, she still would have lost. The second point I want to make clear is what happened in Michigan is just very simple. It's politics the way it's intended to work. If you listen to a community or give the appearance that you're listening to a community, if you show up in a community and go to their local restaurants and allow your people to inundate them with mailers every single day, fine, they contain disinformation. But the point is, it was a constituency being courted and being told, these people are not listening to you. And then the second part of it is those people—
You're saying by the Trump people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then the second part of that, and the reason that level of disinformation worked, is they weren't listening to you. And I want, another point on this side note, the amount of disinformation we do as a democracy supporting organization, a great deal of work on mis and disinformation. And it was extraordinary. I was getting texts on my phone from family members where I had to say, this isn't real. This is not who's paying for it. This is a dark money ad. This is not put out by the Harris campaign. They did it in Michigan to Arab American voters, and they did it in Pennsylvania to Jewish American voters. They were and are regrettably very effective in this kind of messaging that happened.
Can you elaborate on some of that messaging?
So you have parallel leaflets. Rania was explaining it to it, and really intense social media texting. So you've got a lot of it came at you in every way that you can, multiple times a week. So like on an average week, you'd get 4 or 5 pieces of mail from the Trump campaign. And it would say things like, frankly, some of it was purely anti-Semitic. It would literally say things like, Doug Emhoff, Kamala Harris's Jewish husband, and then had a flag, the Israeli flag behind them, sending him specifically to Arab American households to suggest that that is a reason to worry about this. Then in the one that went to the Jewish American community in Pennsylvania, it was a photograph of Kamala Harris with the Palestinian flag behind her. So it was And it was designed, some of them, to look like they were coming from the campaign, because in the case of Michigan, it was like encouraging you to vote for Kamala Harris, except it literally had the Israeli flag on it. So you thought, oh, the campaign is putting out material that's doing this. So it's harmful to our democracy, it's harmful to our constituency, and it's across the board really, really dangerous. So the point I would make, though, about Michigan is candidates outperformed, third-party candidates outperformed in Michigan, and folks stayed at home in a way that was really unfortunate. We've done the analysis on specific precincts nationally to try to get we built a model to try to get a better sense of how did Arab Americans vote nationally. And our poll, the last poll we did, asking Arab American voters going into that election was 41-42 within the margin of error. And when we looked at the specific precincts we highlighted to get a better sense of that, it actually was 47% for Kamala Harris and 43% for Donald Trump, with about 8% going third party. To be clear, even though I think the national win for her, it is considerably different than the way that Arab Americans typically vote. We have always had historically a solid third Republican, and then it fluctuates between Democrats and independents in terms of the way that they sway. But to give you a sense of how much voters hemorrhaged here, the vote in 2020 was 59% for Joe Biden at the time and 35% for Donald Trump. When we did the poll in October, after what was clear what was happening in Gaza, those numbers dropped to 17% for Joe Biden and 40% for Donald Trump. It was a 42% decline.
And that story is one that we should focus on, the fact that people didn't show up, 19 million of them. But before I go there, I realized we didn't really define our landscape here. So you say there are 4 million Arab Americans in this country. It's a fairly diverse group. Where do they live? What do they look like? You've got Justin Amash, for instance, and Rashida Tlaib. So who are the Arab Americans in America?
Yeah, I say nearly 4 million. To be honest with you, I think it's actually over 4 million. We're in the process of updating our demographics. Part of the reason we don't have an accurate count is we don't have an accurate way to measure our community based on a category on the census and in terms of our race and ethnicity. We did secure for the first time ever a new checkbox last year. And as our country is now going to become, quote, post-racial, and it will be illegal to collect any race and ethnicity data, I'm deeply troubled by what's coming.
I think ICE may be interested in that data.
Sure, for sure. It's an incredibly diverse community. It's been coming here for a very long time. Initially, the largest numbers came from what was Lebanon and Syria. Historically, we've seen increases with every wave that you see in terms of conflict and wars in the region. You will see more that have come here. We saw a major student. Alexa Knapp, the historian, used to say that Arab Americans almost assimilated themselves out of existence, and it was the 1967 war and the influx of additional students from the region. So a lot of Egyptians, a lot of Palestinians, who really in some ways reinvigorated the community. So we are as diverse as you can imagine, and we are spread out all in every country, in every state in the country, with a particular focus, though, that makes our job a little bit easier at the Institute in 12 key states. I would love to have the capacity to do the kind of, get out the voter work everywhere, but it's really concentrated in 12 key states, concentrated in metropolitan areas. So we're talking Michigan, Ohio, Virginia, Florida, New York, New Jersey, California, Texas. Some of those tend to be really important in terms of electoral states. So you do have, I've always said that given where we're concentrated, our vote actually has a higher impact. We're certainly within the margin of error in places like Michigan and Ohio, Minnesota. So it's as representative and as diverse as you would imagine it to be.
I want to
Margaret,
say one thing. Sorry, real quick.
Sorry, this is Rania speaking. Please go ahead.
Yeah, apologies. Yes, it's Rania. Just one thing I want to just say, because Maya rightly mentioned the blame game that always happens, frankly, after after an election, like who's to blame, and you know, the postmortem, which I hate that term, but that happens, is rarely a real look at what actually happened. So I just always feel the need to put a finer point on Kamala Harris did not only lose Michigan, she did not only lose the Arab American vote. It wasn't only Arab Americans that stayed home. And so I just feel very, very, she literally lost every battleground state. And also in battleground states where the Democratic senator won statewide and then she lost. So, you know, that's a whole nother conversation for another day, but I just want to say that out loud.
And honestly, just not forgetting this point, with 48% of with 48% of Americans telling us that Gaza was on their mind going into that ballot box, we also need to remember how much that issue was of concern to young voters, how much it was a concern to minority voters, how much it was a concern for Black women. This was not just our issue in this election. So I think that's also a piece of this that we need to continue to elevate.
Agreed. Thank you, Maya. Margaret, I guess to follow up on those two comments, 19 million people didn't show up. 19 million people is, 4.25 times 4 million people. No, 4.7 times more than that. So who are these other people? And can you just highlight the fact that this election was lost due to the reality that people didn't show up to vote for the Democrat?
Was going to have the mute problem. Thanks, Ahmed, for that. Yeah, I mean, to Rania and Maya's point, I think too much of the media coverage in particular, and I think the campaign focus as well, treated this as a problem, an Arab American problem, a Muslim American problem, a Michigan problem. And organizations, I imagine like AAI, IMEU Policy Project for sure, we were screaming from the rooftops, this is a bigger problem. This obviously is a concern to Arab and Muslim Americans, but it goes far beyond that. And if you look at the polling data, that was clear, right? So just a few figures that Maya referenced. In polls that came out, there was a CBS poll I'll start with in June of 2024. CBS News poll found 77% of Democrats, 77% of all voters under 30, 75% of Black voters, 66% of women, and 64% of Hispanic voters supported ending U.S. supplied weapons to Israel. 2 weeks before the election, the New York Times reported that the Trump campaign's data showed that undecided voters were 6 times as likely as other battleground state voters to be motivated by their views of Israel's war in Gaza. So this issue went well beyond the Arab American community, the Muslim American community, and voters in Michigan. And there's no question when you look at the numbers that the Democratic base stayed home, right? Harris didn't necessarily lose because voters switched to Trump. She lost because voters stayed home. They chose the couch, right, over her. She received 6 million fewer votes than Biden did in 2020. Ahmed, you referenced the 19 million. That's based on an analysis of AP Vocast data estimates. As many as 19 million Biden 2020 voters did not vote. A lot of that turnout drop occurred in major cities in key swing states, so in Detroit, Philadelphia, and Phoenix.
And then, so what are the implications, I guess, for the Democrats? And then this is really a question for everybody here. You've got a coalition, you've got a much maligned and disliked minority called Arab Americans, fine. But the group of people who didn't show up is several times that number. And so what are the implications going forward? And maybe, Rania, you can lead the answer here, given your work with the Uncommitted campaign. And perhaps it's worth talking about your work with the Uncommitted campaign.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the Uncommitted campaign started, as most people know, in Michigan with a group of local incredible organizers. I helped with some of their paid media efforts, and just as often, just we all do, right? We just give an extra set of hands wherever we can. it grew into other states. I think it was an incredible effort that was always focused around the primary. I think that what they did, was nearly a million voters across the country that registered exactly what they thought. It was to say, we are Democrats and we are saying we're voting uncommitted because of your stance and because of what you're doing specifically on your policy with Israel and what's happening in Gaza. Now, I think I've heard a lot of things kind of circulating in obviously in the last months, and as we were just talking about, there's this the finger pointing that always happens after a loss, and we saw it with some of the talking heads on some of the cable news shows after Trump said his insane Riviera thing, and one of I'm not going to name names because I just don't even want to, but one of the talking heads said, we wouldn't have had to, in response to one of the founding organizers of Uncommitted putting out a very, frankly, thoughtful statement to Trump's Riviera comment. One of the talking heads said, we would not have had to worry about ethnic cleansing under a Kamala Harris administration. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but that was the gist. And my head nearly exploded. I think maybe our collective heads nearly exploded, because you sort of go like, it's the ultimate form of gaslighting to watch your people being genocided, and the ethnic cleansing that had already started in the West Bank. Frankly, I apologize for being so animated, but it's infuriating. That had already started under the Biden administration with the funding and the blessing of the Biden administration and all of his little minions. And to have somebody with a straight face look into a camera and say, this is your fault and we wouldn't have had to worry about it, there are no words. I do words for a living and I have no words. So this is where the wheels have really fallen off, because I have no words. So anyway, it's really, really an incredible, it's incredible and not surprising all at the same time. And I think I encourage anyone who's listening, anybody who cares and continues to organize and engage, I think, and just understand that this is a tactic that is used over and over and over again. One, I think, to continue to scare us into submission, which Maya and Margaret have heard me use this term over and over again, because that is what it is. It's a bullying tactic. It's a tactic to get us to, frankly, sit down and shut up and not rock the boat and just fall in line. Genocide be damned. Just you sit down and you fall in line. And I say this and I know, and I will just repeat that FMEP is a 501c3, so this is me speaking as me. I'm a lifelong Democrat, and I helped to build this party, and I refuse to sit down and shut up and not register exactly how I feel. And so, anyway, the point being, I think the work of Uncommitted, to your original question, the work of Uncommitted was really, really, really important in showing that this is not, it started in Michigan, absolutely, but it happened all across the country. And another really important point about the Uncommitted movement, it was majority non-Arab, non-Palestinian, non-Muslim. The people that were involved in that movement were outside of our community. They were our allies, they were collaborators, they were part of our coalition, but they were not Arab, Muslim, Palestinian. And that is what the White House, the Biden campaign, and then the Harris campaign tried to paint this picture. And in fact, Biden said it out loud, behind closed doors, and then out loud, oh, by November, they'll get over it. They being Arabs and Muslims, they'll get over it. That was the idea. And unfortunately, this is what we all got stuck with, the regime that we are in, all of the horrible things that are happening now. If we're going to lay blame, let me tell you where I'm putting it. It's not with me. It's not with my community. I'm sorry to be this way, and I'm sorry to be so prickly about it, but
I'm with you.
I'm not taking that, because They refused to listen. And again, it wasn't just us saying it. It wasn't just us coming. And I was part of so many meetings, closed door, and so many activations out front. And the majority of the people who were showing up were outside of our community because they cared that much. I'm gonna stop now.
So, it's a great point. Do we have a coalition here? What do we do, Maya? Do we just say, forget this? Both parties are equally hostile, and consequently, I want nothing to do with any of this, which I think a lot of people decided in November. How do we recover? What do we do? And then what's the utility of the data and the coalition?
Yeah. So I just want to add something and then come back to that on Rania's point about the ethnic cleansing on CNN comment. It was made, and as Rania correctly pointed out, imagine that, because at a time where if we said ethnic cleansing, there are some who tried to deem that as engaging in anti-Semitic speech. But after the election is over, you now all of a sudden acknowledge that ethnic cleansing is happening and say, but look, the Trump White House is doing it. So the amount, again, of disinformation and cognitive dissonance one has to deploy in order to kind of have the conversation we're having about this topic is really, really challenging. The second point I would make is, Ahmed, I'm going to push back. I don't think we're a much maligned community at all, to be honest with you. I think we're very misunderstood. And I think that the anti-Arab racism that comes into play, specifically the dehumanization of Palestinians, that plays out is very, very real. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it when our civil rights are viewed outside of the traditional civil rights bucket, so to speak. We come in with sensitive issues. We come in as deeply politicized. We come in as existentially foreign. All of that is obviously unacceptable. And that's part of how this engagement has been so central to the work of the Institute over these decades, is that we are who we are. We're proud of our community. We're proud of our ethnicity. We're proud of the contributions we've made specifically to this country. We're proud of our public servants. And that hasn't taken away from any of the work that we do here. It is one, though, and I have to say, in Michigan in particular, Michigan has an election coming up in November of this year, both a governor's race as well as municipal elections. And you know what? We're going to do our polling, but they're actually polling Arab American voters now. They understand there is a need. There is a constituency that's important, and they need to make sure that they are connecting with it as they should be. And I think that's a new development in terms of polling since the 24 election. So I think that's incredibly important. I don't think we go anywhere. I don't think we stay home. In fact, another piece that's come out of our analysis is that in Michigan, Arab Americans voted at pretty much the same amount as they did last time. They just went more third party in Michigan than they did elsewhere.
So what's the message there?
The message is quite simple. At least it is for me, and I honestly don't mean to be glib about it. And Rania's point is important. We're a C3 organization as well. It's not that we're bipartisan. We are nonpartisan. To me, we're not broken. It's not the Arab American community that's broken right now. American democracy is breaking right now, and our ability to directly impact the outcome of an election, or to be able to petition your government while they're in office. Because right now we're talking about things that aren't normal, right? Things have changed. Well, when Biden was in office, and I agree, by the way, that the threat we're facing now is considerably worse and different. But when Biden was in office, we spent months petitioning our government, showing them data, showing them all of this information that suggested that not only overwhelmingly Democratic voters, because it was a Democratic administration, but average Americans thought this was a deeply flawed American approach to what was happening there, and yet nothing moved. So the system itself, our democratic system, small d democracy, is having issues, and had them before, and they are certainly amplified now. And like us as a constituency, we're going to continue to deeply engage the same way that Black Americans are going to engage and make sure their rights are protected, the same way that the Latino community is responding to the kinds of raids that we're seeing, to the same way the LGBTQ community is having to respond to the assault that they're on. There's no community now that isn't building together and in partnership. And I know we don't have the time or the capacity to talk about it, but the response to what's happening to Mahmoud Khalil is an example of that. Folks finally understand that when they come for you, and we've told you before in multiple examples, from CVE to BIE to Sharia law to banning DEI, we've told you before, when they come for us, they will come for you. It's just a matter of time. And I think people, the way they're responding to Mahmoud's case is an example of like, this is wrong. This is un-American, and it's about compromising our freedoms in a way that that we're not willing to do so. So I think it just means we organize more, we do more, we fight like hell more. Sorry to swear, but yeah, there's a lot that it doubles down on the need to amplify our voices and to continue to building power with those who we align with on our values.
I actually really appreciate that message, and it resonates with me, the idea of coalition building away from concentrated wealth that funds campaigns. Margaret, we started the conversation with you, and I'm going to ask you a question, but feel free really to talk about whatever you feel is pertinent and urgent. What is the IMEU's, both branches of the IMEU, what is the theory of change here? I mean, if the idea is that we're going to collect data, share data, illustrate the reality, and the reality, at least before the election, was ignored. Now we have this new data from January 2025. What is the utility? How do you think about that in concrete terms? And then who are the coalition partners who are going to drive change? Because I assume there's an idea around change here.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Ahmed. And I'll spend a little time answering it, but then I think I do want to touch on something else as we are probably nearing the end of the conversation. Look, we believe very strongly that everyone benefits when they have more information, when awareness is raised, when they understand the complicated issues that face our country and the world. And so, our theory of change is grounded in giving Americans the access to Palestinian voices and stories, helping them understand the harm that continued U.S. government support for an apartheid regime. And let's be clear, that's what the State of Israel is. Every major human rights organization on the planet agrees that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid against the Palestinian people, and now the atrocity of genocide as well. Educating Americans and American policymakers about how that harms us as Americans and the world. Will lead to through coalition building and through mobilization and a whole range of efforts, obviously will lead to policy change. But I think what I want to close on is tying back to what you said, Rania and Maya and Ahmed, about values and about the coalition, right? And I think it's important for us to understand, and for Democrats who want to win elections to understand, that the issue of Gaza was not an outlier, right? So Democratic voters saw the Harris campaign with Liz Cheney, talk about the one thing she would do differently from Joe Biden was bring a Republican into her cabinet, silence Palestinian and Arab American voices, right? She's on the campaign stage talking about how, we want the U.S. military to be the most lethal fighting force in the world, right? That tracking to the right and continuing to cater to these elusive, disaffected Republican voters who will switch party and vote Democratic is a losing strategy. And it proves to be a losing strategy election after election after election. The base of the Democratic Party is supportive of Palestinian human rights. We see that in the polls. They're supportive of immigrant rights. They want the U.S. to play a more positive peacemaking, peace-building force in the world, and not to have their tax dollars continue to be used to fund war crimes and violence against families and children overseas. So I think beginning to understand how all of these issues are part of a values spectrum, right? That this coalition cares deeply about will serve all of us well. And I think that's the path to creating the kind of change that we need to see in this country.
I mean, powerful concluding words. Thank you, Margaret. I'd like to thank my three guests today, Maya Berry of the Arab American Institute, Margaret DeReus of IMEU, and Rania Batrice, an independent consultant who's worked in democratic policymaking for a long time, for this invaluable conversation. I really wish we had more time to speak. I think each of you had so many important insights to offer. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.